With this challah bread recipe, I wanted to see how close I could come to replicating the gluteny, pillowy, soft texture of typical challah bread, but with using whole grain flour in place of the refined white bread flour typically called for. Isn't one of the great things about fresh challah its tender, gluteny dough? This is one of a series of videos where we'll look at baking some really awesome tasting bread and other baked goods that are also awesomely good for you. For the most part, challah is a pretty easy bread to make and fast. This is a half-day venture from start to finish. Compared to most artisan bread recipes, it's fast food. This recipe makes a small loaf, about a 1-pound loaf. Challah is best warm, fresh out of the oven. If you're a small family and don't want much in the way of leftovers, this is perfect. If you want a larger loaf, no problem, just double all the ingredients and add a few minutes to the bake time. I've experimented with a number of different flours for challah bread, and today I'm going to use hard white wheat for its dough strength and mild flavor. Flour is the key ingredient in any bread recipe, and as is the case with many bread recipes, the finer the flour, the better. And challah is certainly one of those recipes. I'll run the wheat berries through the mock mill grain mill, which does an amazing job of milling fine flour. If you don't have a mill, no worries. I'll show you where you can find good flour. This flour is wonderfully fine, and as far as I take it most of the time. But for this recipe, for this video, I'm going to take it a step further. I'm going to sift the flour through this 40 mesh screen and remill the bran. This is a fair amount of bran, and coarse bran is what can compromise the gluteny texture of the dough. But it also has enormous health benefits. By passing the bran back through the mill and recombining with the flour, we end up with an ideal flour for this recipe. Now mix the dry ingredients into the flour. Salt, sugar, yeast, all the quantities are on the website for you to print out. And in your mixing bowl, combine the wet ingredients, water, eggs, and oil. Then the dry into the wet. Once everything is reasonably well combined, cover and just let it sit for about 10 minutes to give the flour a little bit of time to absorb the moisture. After the rest period, you can do one of a couple things. You can knead it for about 5 to 10 minutes straight, or you can do a series of stretch and folds. Stretch and fold is where you just do a quick 10 to 15 second knead and do about 4 of those at about 10-minute intervals. That's what I'll do. If you need to wet your fingers to keep the dough from sticking, then do that. It works great. And if the dough is sticking to the bowl like crazy, you can use your dough scraper to scrape it off. So that was more than 10 to 15 seconds, but you get the idea. So I'm going to come back and do another one of those in 10 minutes and then a couple more. After kneading, or the last stretch and fold, you can just let it proof until the dough is about doubled in volume, which might take anywhere from 1 to 2 hours depending on your room temperature. It's been about an hour and a half since we started kneading the dough, and it's risen nicely. So now the fun part, the braiding. And there's all kinds of ways of braiding dough, of braiding challah. I like the 6-strand braid, which I'm not that good at, but it comes out okay most of the time. So hopefully it will this time too. The strands need to be pretty equal. So I'm going to divide the dough into 6 equal portions. Once I've got the dough divided out into 6 equal balls, I'm going to roll them out into strands. Kind of like this. And what I'm trying to do is get them about this long, with them being a little bit fatter in the middle and then kind of tapering off towards the ends. It doesn't have to be super precise. Mine never are anyway. There are tons of YouTube videos on braiding challah. Definitely recommend checking those out. In fact, I'll put a link in the written instructions on our site to one in particular that I like a lot. So you're going to position the strands like this, sort of, and pinch the ends together at one end so it doesn't unravel. And one thing I've learned is that you definitely don't want to braid it too tightly. In fact, this might be a little bit too tight. It can cause a splitting during baking. Now, that's one of the things that can cause splitting. When you start getting close to the end here, it gets pretty tricky. So at some point, like about now, you pretty much just have to call it a day and pinch the ends together and kind of tuck it underneath. And then it goes on to a parchment lined baking sheet and gets a light egg wash. And then a sprinkling of poppy seeds or sesame seeds is traditional. Now it's going to rise again. How long, as usual, depends on room temperature. It could be as little as an hour, probably not more than 2 or so. It'll rise a decent amount, maybe about 50%. It probably won't double, we'll see. After this second rise, it's been about an hour and a half. It's looking pretty well risen and pretty poofy. So it's into a 350-degree oven for about 20 minutes until the internal temperature of the dough is at about 190 degrees. And I'll give it a little steam too. I found it's important not to leave the bread in the oven any longer than necessary so it doesn't dry out. So I'm going to check it right at 20 minutes and see how it's doing. And it's right at 190, just a tad over. So it's done baking. There's always some variation in how these turn out, and this one is actually a little bit better than normal for me. Sometimes I get some splitting or some tearing along the surface, which is caused by underproofing and consequently too much rise, too much oven spring during baking. Or it comes from braiding it too tightly, or some combination of those two. But this one came out okay. This small loaf will cool pretty quickly. After about 20 minutes, I'll cut into it while it's still a bit warm. The crumb is soft and tender and pretty light. I really like this bread and look forward to getting feedback from some of you. This recipe delivers the challah experience, but with, I think, a better flavor that the whole grain provides. Please try it and let me know how it goes.